Welcome to At Issue. I'm H. Wayne Wilson. A lot is happening on the national scene with Charlottesville, with North Korea, with the economy, what will happen with infrastructure, and more. And to have a discussion about those issues is Cheri Bustos. She is the Congresswoman from the 17th Congressional District. Your home is Moline, but right. You represent parts of Peoria, parts of Rockford, and west to the Mississippi.
11 counties in between.
Welcome back to the program as usual. And let's start with Charlottesville. An unfortunate rally occurred down there with violence. Without my describing the president's remarks, and by the way, this was taped on Wednesday, so things may have changed in the intervening days.
By the time this airs, yeah.
But as of now, what's your personal take on the president's reaction to Charlottesville?
Well, considering he's a president should be statesmanlike and should help set the tone for a nation. And when you have people who are marching in the name of hate and discrimination, you would hope that the person sitting in the White House would do everything he could to express to the American public how distasteful that is. And we've seen anything but that. I'm disappointed in his reaction. I have to say that I'm embarrassed by his reaction to this, and I think that that people, and I don't care whether you're white or black or brown or anything else, male, female, Jewish, Christian, we as a nation deserve better than what we're seeing right now.
Can Congress do anything about the president's remarks? Is there anything within the power of Congress?
Well, I think we need to talk about what we should expect out of the president. I think we should talk about what we should be doing as Congress. You know, I'm on the Transportation Committee and I'm on the Ag Committee. Our 5-year farm bill, which I was involved with helping to negotiate when I was first elected to Congress, will expire next year, and we've got to start those negotiations. We need to pass a 5-year $1 trillion infrastructure package, and not to mention tax reform, not to mention a jobs package. We should be doing all of that, yet a day doesn't go by where we don't have a distraction of some sort, whether it's a midnight tweet coming from the president, whether it's the president not reacting in a way that is one bit statesmanlike out of what happened in Charlottesville. We need to get the nation's business done, and we have to do that by working together. And I'm not sure if the president is going to welcome working together to make some things happen.
As of this taping, we have heard very little from congressional leadership, save John McCain. Why are we not hearing something? I mean, not that there's action to be taken, but can't leadership of Congress come out and say more?
Well, of course, and I guess I would hedge on that just a little bit. There's the leader of our party has made statements. Mitch McConnell, as we sit here at this moment, has not said one word yet about this. Paul Ryan issued a tweet that was, of course, 140 characters or less, and I have not seen, as you said, with very few exceptions, Republicans in leadership standing up and disavowing how this president has reacted to a terrible, what will be viewed as a terrible chapter in American history. This is serious. The fact that we are sitting here in 2017. And you have avowed racists, avowed nationalists, which means, if these nationalists are saying that this should be a white America, and actually views people who are not white Americans as something as subhuman. And they don't even cover their faces anymore. They are out there proudly talking about this. And, I represent a congressional district that Donald Trump won. And I choose to look at that as people who voted for Donald Trump did so because he was making promises that I'm going to bring your job home again. I'm going to make our country great. And I'm going to view people that supported him as those who are discouraged by what's happening in the economy. That people who had jobs, for instance, at Maytag, we've talked about Maytag before, that in it's 13 years ago next month that Maytag shipped every last one of those jobs over to Mexico. And yet, still the wages in Knox County have not recovered. So I think people are discouraged about the economy and having to work a couple jobs to make ends meet, not being able to go on vacations like they used to, not being able to buy, a new pickup truck every 5 years. So I think people in our region voted for Donald Trump because of those promises he made. And I think frankly, not only has he been disgraceful on human rights, but I think he's treating us right now as flyover country. To have a proposal to cut the U.S. Department of Agriculture's budget by 21%, to just down the road here say he wants to close that ag lab, that for every $1 we invest, we get close to a $10 return because of the research that it's doing for the ag economy. Donald Trump needs to live up to the promises that he's made to Middle America. And that's where we need to make sure we're holding him accountable as well.
I want to talk about North Korea very briefly, and then I want to get back to the economy. But before we do either one of those, you mentioned the ag lab in Peoria, and in committee, the Trump proposal to close down the ag lab was reversed. What's the status of that?
Well, we still have a fight on our hands because we've made it through step one in the appropriations process, which is we have restored full funding for the ag lab. And I think what's worth mentioning on this, because Congress is, Washington is viewed as dysfunctional, Congress is viewed as dysfunctional. This was an example where Darren LaHood, a Republican, and I, a Democrat, stood together and said that we want to make sure that every last cent is restored for that ag lab. And not only did he and I stand together, but we have the support from Senator Duckworth and Senator Durbin, and every member, all 17 of our 18 members of our Illinois congressional delegation, Democrats and Republicans, signed letters that Darren and I led to the Appropriations Committee and to President Trump, saying we need to make sure that we restore full funding for this. So we have a few more steps we have to go through. There's, in addition to appropriations, obviously you need to make sure that when we vote for full funding, that it's all in there. But yeah, we have hopes that the Ag Lab will stay here for another many generations to come.
Jobs coming up in just a moment, but North Korea, right now a war of words. What's your take on that situation between Kim Jong-un and President Trump?
Well, when President Obama was leaving office, he told President Trump that this would be the toughest security issue that we have, and it is proving to be that. You can't handle foreign policy in 140 characters. And the fact that the man sitting on Pennsylvania Avenue in the White House is choosing to talk about national security through tweets is very troubling. I think he's got some good people in his. I think General Mattis and McMaster. I think we've got some good people who I hope will steer this in the right direction. I voted for the sanctions that came through the House. The United Nations National Security Council imposed in a multilateral way with other nations had passed a very strict sanctions on North Korea that will cost this country about $1 billion if it doesn't get its act in order. But the leader of North Korea is not a rational human being. And what he fears more than anything else is his own power, and that his own people would revolt in any way. And so everything he does is through that lens. And for President Trump to make threats is not the way you deal with a guy like Kim Jong-un, who thinks very differently than a rational human being.
Let's turn to the economy. You mentioned it briefly. You are in leadership in the Democratic Party with Representative Cicilline and Jeffries. You're co-chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. And you're trying to shepherd through a concept known as a better deal. Correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially in simple forms, that's raise wages, lower costs in certain areas, and retrain workers. If we can, let's divide those into three parts. And how do you go about raising wages without causing some inflationary concerns, et cetera?
Well, and this is way beyond just the minimum wage, and I think that's important to note. So when we're talking about better jobs, better wages, and a better future for families like we represent here in central and northwestern Illinois, we're talking about full-time, good-paying jobs. Part of that we can look at companies and how do they treat their employees. Now, this doesn't work for every small and mid-sized business, but there's a concept called Patriot Corporations, and that would be giving tax incentives and giving tax breaks to those companies who pay a living wage that, for example, may offer help with child care, that offer a 401k or some kind of pension benefit, that treat employees as valuable assets, and that's part of that. Back to those folks, though, who do have minimum wage jobs, and we haven't seen the minimum wage raised in a number of years. I mean, that's part of the equation. But we also have to look at, there are so many small and mid-sized manufacturers who have job openings and can't fill them. And so part of this also is to look at an apprentice program. By the way, when President Trump is talking about an apprentice program, he actually wiped that out in his budget. And I think that's also worth noting. We're saying we need to shore that up.
When you talk about there are jobs out there, and surveys show there are hundreds of thousands of jobs that are unfilled because there aren't qualified workers for those positions, wouldn't you think that then the economy would be such that the price would go up, the wages would go up? And we're not seeing that. We're seeing stagnation essentially in wages across most industries. So how does your plan correct that?
Well, it corrects it by getting people ready for those higher tech jobs. We do economic roundtables in Peoria, the Quad Cities, and Rockford. Then we take what we've learned from those economic roundtables and we roll those up into an annual economic summit. And we have taken on this skills gap as a project in our congressional district. And what I realized after doing our very first economic summit is who we had missing sitting around the table were the K through 12 folks in education. We had community colleges and we had four-year college representation, but we didn't have the K through 12. We've got to get kids ready at a much younger age to be ready for the next generation of our workforce. And I think we will see wages going up because of the shortage of the skilled workforce and being able to fill some of these jobs. I think we'll see that over time, but we need really a relentless and nonstop focus on what our next generation of our workforce looks like.
Another part of a better deal agenda is lowering costs, specifically lowering prescription costs, lowering the cost of education. Can you explain how you're going to go about lowering prescription costs?
Yeah, we're not in, for instance, in Medicare. The federal government is not allowed to negotiate the price of prescription drug costs. And we do that through the VA. And I think it makes absolutely no sense. And you would see, I think we'll see this on both sides of the aisle, whether this should not have a Republican tag to it or a Democratic tag to it. But it makes perfect sense to be able to negotiate the cost of prescription drug prices. We also are talking about the pharmaceutical companies that have price gouged people.
EpiPen being the classic example.
That went viral because this is something that increased by it went from $100 some to $600 some
$700, yeah.
And literally overnight, indiscriminately. I have a son who has to carry an EpiPen with him, and any parent or any child who does have to have an EpiPen knows that this is a lifesaver, and it's not like you want to, I just want an EpiPen. You need an EpiPen if you have some kind of allergy, and that saves your life. The other thing is we've got to crack down on pharmaceutical companies if there's price gouging involved with that as well. And it's the same thing with the costs of health care. It's a major economic impact on families and on our national budget. There are so many ways that we could address the Affordable Care Act without doing what happened in the House and the Senate. In our congressional district alone, we would have more than 40,000 people who would lose their health insurance under the plan that passed out of the House of Representatives, with 0 Democrats voting for that. In the state of Illinois, just our state, we would lose 60,000 jobs under that plan. And if we would just get back to the old-fashioned way of doing politics, and that's sitting down and figuring out what's not working in the Affordable Care Act. And there are many components that aren't working, but most of them revolve around the price of prescription drugs and what people are having to pay on premiums and co-pays and deductibles. And that is where we should start, and then take it from there and what else we need to get fixed.
With regard to ACA, you already addressed prescriptions, but what about premiums? What can Congress do to try to control the increase in premiums?
Well, we have some counties in the nation that we're calling them BEAR counties now, and that doesn't mean B-E-A-R, but BEAR as B-A-R-E, as in we don't have insurance companies that have any programs to offer in various counties. So, one proposal is allowing people to buy into, for instance, there's a proposal right now by one of the candidates running for governor about allowing people, if there's not another option, to buy into the state's health plan. There's talk about could we lower the age of people being able to buy into Medicare? That is another example. But certainly taking away this cost-sharing reduction, which is part of the Affordable Care Act and part of what President Trump is saying he wants to get rid of, it would be devastating across the board. That would raise premiums by 20%. So rather than take away this cost-sharing, we actually need to make sure that that is in effect for people where health insurance is unaffordable. And I know that's getting a little technical, but that is part of what we need to make sure that we keep in place.
And one of the problems is that young people aren't buying insurance. Even with penalties, they're not buying insurance because essentially they're rolling the dice that the chances of me having something wrong is minimal. Do you see a plan where you can get across the board participation?
There are plans out there. I can tell you that I am not well enough versed to have a deep conversation, other than the fact that I have 3 sons, 2 of whom were part of the Affordable Care Act because they were under the age of 26 at the time. And I know my youngest son just did not see the value in buying into that because, he's viewed as, he looks at this, hey, I'm 26 years old, I go to the gym every day, I'm healthy. And so there has to be some kind of incentive to make sure that young people do see the value in that.
The third leg of a better deal is essentially a retraining program. Is it fair to just simplify it to retraining?
Yeah, apprentice programs, making sure that people are ready for the next generation of the workforce, making sure that the jobs of the future, that we are training people at a younger age, getting people ready at a younger age for what those jobs are. More collaboration between the private sector and K through 12 and also community colleges. We should operate a lot more. Germany's a good model for that, where there's cooperation with education and the workforce, and we could do a lot better at that in our country. A better deal calls for 10 million jobs over 5 years if it were to be implemented. That sounds like an awfully lofty goal. I mean, did you pick that out of because it sounds good? No, it's actually based in fact and has economists backing that up. Part of that would come from a robust infrastructure package, frankly. And if we did indeed pass a $1 trillion infrastructure package, which has support both from Republicans and Democrats, a lot of those would be jobs rebuilding our nation's infrastructure, our highways, our bridges, revamping our rail. And so a lot of those jobs would even come naturally out of that. In January, you introduced a bill called the Overseas Outsourcing Accountability Act.
It was sent to committee, and we haven't heard a word. Is it, may I say, is it dead on arrival?
Well, so I'll explain to the viewers what it is. It called for President Trump to present a jobs proposal to Congress so we could have something to vote on. And it's very practical. So I'm proud of the fact that we introduced that and had support, at least from Democrats, on saying, Mr. President, please present a jobs proposal to us and make sure that there is a plan that those jobs are created in our country rather than being sent overseas. I happen to think in a very deep way that there should be absolutely no tax incentive for any kind of company that would send jobs overseas. There's something that we have dubbed these patriot corporations that would basically be companies that are good to their employees, and where they put their employees not last on the list, but at least on par with shareholders, where there's a child care program where they're paying a living wage, where there's a pension or a 401k. We want companies to be incentivized to do that through a tax system. But back to your question about was it dead on arrival? It absolutely should not have been. If I were a brand new president of this country, the first thing I would have done was to have a jobs program. And I would have done that through making good on what President Trump's promise was, to have $1 trillion infrastructure package pass Congress. And here we are in the second half of his first year in office, and there has not been one significant piece of legislation that has passed. And the unfortunate part of this is that we have these midnight tweets, we have these constant distractions, and the American public deserves a heck of a lot better. And what we should be doing is talking about infrastructure and jobs and affordable education, and making sure that people have full-time, good-paying jobs. And that's what we should be working every single day on in Washington.
Twice you've mentioned the issue of incentives for corporations, for companies creating jobs in America, et cetera. What are the prospects for tax reform, a fairness of taxes, both individually and corporate-wise?
Well, that is probably where there are the biggest political differences in Washington. Again, why we can't come together and pass an infrastructure bill, I don't know, because I don't think that should have a partisan label. And where the differences come down on tax reform is where are tax breaks taken away and where are tax incentives added. On the Democratic side, we think small and mid-sized businesses, family-owned businesses, we need to do a better job for them. It's tough to start a business and succeed these days. And I hope when we look at it from a business perspective, that's where we do right by these small business owners. Same thing with middle-class families. That's where we want to make sure that people can thrive. When it comes to that top 1% that has this increasing level of wealth that have gone their way, I don't want to get into any class warfare, but they're going to have to pay their fair share, and make sure that we're strengthening our middle class. It's always been what's made America great, is the middle class, and we've seen that shrink and shrink and shrink. And as we look at tax reform, those would be my priorities that I would take to the table.
Let's turn to the wall along the Mexican border. The Republicans have put forth legislation that would, I think it's $1.6 billion for a stretch in Texas. And this was just the first step, and of course Mexico is not paying for it. So is building a wall across the Mexican border, is that good policy in your estimation?
Well, what we need to address is the root of the problem, and we need comprehensive immigration reform. I actually thought when I was first elected that we would have a chance of doing something with that in bipartisan fashion. That used to be an issue where Democrats and Republicans could come together. And so to think that this wall should be the first step before we have comprehensive immigration reform that looks at people of the 11 million people who are in our country, who came in not through documentation, and what we're going to do to address that. Now, I think if there are people who have entered our country illegally and have committed crimes, I would be absolutely on the same page as many others to say that that's not the kind of immigrant that we want in our country. But you know, what has made our country great is the vast diversity of our nation, and let's first have comprehensive immigration reform before we talk about a wall that's likely not going to happen.
And with that, we have to say thank you to Congresswoman Cheri Bustos for visiting with us. As always, you're always welcome to come back to At Issue. Thank you so much for being here. And next week, we'll cross the aisle and we'll visit with her counterpart, Darren LaHood of Peoria, the Republican congressman from Central Illinois. Join us for Darren LaHood next time on At Issue.